Today, I am learning that what was happening in one part of the world was also happening across parts of the world much closer to where I live now in Australia. What I would like to do now is to invite each of our speakers to reflect on the common features of the heroes that they have presented for us in the development of children's rights around the world. For me, what I find most striking, number one, is the parallel in time, that these developments are happening at the same time in very different parts of the world. It seems to me that very often they are happening each time in response to great society upheaval, where we see children suffering very greatly. The other thing that strikes me, though, is the common features between what each of our heroes was saying about children and about how we as adults should respond to the needs and vulnerabilities of children. So, the first question that I have for each of the panelists is to ask about the connections. I have mentioned very briefly the parallels. Can you draw connections between our people? We've seen that between Yanis Kurchov and Eglantin Webb there were obvious connections. But could I ask each of you to reflect on the extent to which our heroes were aware of the parallel developments in other parts of the world? Milda, would you like to start?
Yeah, I will try. I think it's not so easy to explain the context in which these ideas developed. What seems to be obvious is that all these persons who paved the way to a better understanding to children's rights lived in very difficult situations. They lived in a context of hardship, suppressing, let's even call it catastrophes. And these were not only individual catastrophes, but entire societies were under pressure and in need. And I think this creates opportunities to reflect what is life good for. And also it seems to me very natural that turns attention to children in such situations. You see what the adults have produced: catastrophes, misery, atrocities. And now you hope there is a young generation which can improve living together in societies and mankind. And to make it possible, you must prepare conditions for growing up which preserves the original capacities of children. Maybe this is a similarity, maybe very general, but maybe it helps to go on.
Yes, well, I think in what I have learned when I was studying about Toyohiko Kagawa is that even 100 years ago, or even 200 years ago, the world was quite small and interconnected. And for instance, Toyohiko Kagawa could not come up with the idea of the children as a subject of rights if he has no contact with his friends or maybe philosophers he has never met when he's alive. Namely, he has learned quite a lot from the West and as well as in his local colleagues. And what I understood is that human rights as a universal legal and ethical norm has developed as you mentioned, in parallel in the different parts of the world, but while being interconnected and intercommunicated and interacted in several ways. So that's really fascinating thing. Even though in 100 years ago we had the age of this imperialism, but underneath we have such communication. That's really something that I found really fascinating.
It's evident that Bang Jong-han lived in the same period as Mr. Kagawa. And he studied in Japan too, and I think that might be where his influences from Montessori came in, and respecting children's developing needs. But also, I think we have to remember that we had lots of Western missionaries that came into Korea during that time too, and perhaps we were influenced, he was influenced to a certain degree. But the start of the religion, Cheondogyo, is I think a very important influence in how he challenged the existing society and challenged Confucianism. And as we heard this morning, Confucianism is not it's not as hierarchical as we might think it is. And so I think it's as Mr. Professor Morita says, the world was small and interconnected. We think that young generation, we are all interconnected by social networking now, but I think although people never met, I'm sure Mr. Kagawa never met Bang Jong-han, and Bang Jong-han never met Janusz Korczak, nor Eglinton Jeb, but their ideas emerged around the same time. And I think sociological evolution might be universal. It may be happening in parallel. Of course, it was in response to oppression and catastrophe and disaster, man-made disasters, as well as natural disasters. But I think it's maybe I'm no Darwin fan or I'm no Darwin student, but the process of social evolution might have pointed all of these pioneers to point to similar aspects.
I think that is a very insightful comment, typically insightful comment from Professor Lee. I am a lawyer, unlike most of my panel here, but I've got to say that when you look at the way that law develops internationally, it is very organic. And one of the fascinating things about this panel, I think, is that what we are seeing in 4 different parts of the world is very similar ideas developing and being transformed into rules, into norms, into law. And that is how international law at its most foundational and organic, how it grows, how it develops. It's when all ideas come together, like a twine, like a vine, and they make a rope that becomes the idea that becomes accepted by so many people that it is regarded, and they use a Latin term, jus cogens, customary international law. Everybody is doing the same thing. So what I think we've seen today, and I was just fascinated this morning with Professor Song's discussion of how human rights and Confucianism can work together. What we're seeing is that each of these four heroes, I'm going to call them heroes, each of them are coming the product of their own culture, of their own time, of their own experience. I don't get caught up in the language of rights, no. In Australia, rights are not very popular. We don't think in terms of rights. But we will all agree with what should be happening for children. And so I think for us, we should not try to expect that all our heroes would speak the same language in terms of the words that they use. Rather, what I would like to do is ask you, invite you, to think about the concept, the idea that you think was common across all of the four heroes that carries forward to help us develop the law that we have today. So, what do you think is the most common message from each of our heroes? I ask hard questions.
Indeed, as a lawyer.
They want to consult.
I think it's also my personal belief that the human rights means that individuals are different. Each individual is different, but must be respected equally. So that's a kind of a view of humans and view of children, and embraced by the concept of human rights. And Toyohiko Kagawa, what he advocated, I think, was exactly this view of humans. Namely, respect as individual, also allowing the difference and the diversity.
Yeah. Respect. Rosa?
I just agree. I said in my talk for Crock, I really think respect is the core. He respected the child. Also when a child made mistakes or behaved in a way which is not acceptable. I think that's the situation, the test for the way you really respect a child. And he did it. And he did it. Also the court of peers looked for reconciliation, not for punishment, because also the peers among themselves had learned to respect each other. And I think the other heroes used similar terms. Maybe they didn't use the word dignity explicitly. Maybe this is a more modern term, and it's also a very difficult term. But I think you all pointed out that there is a close relationship between what we call respect, attentiveness to the other, care of him or her, and dignity. So I think it's this complex of meanings that is in the center of the thinking of all these outstanding persons.
I would have to agree with our panelists that respect for the individual was the core message. And because you're a human being born, that you deserve this respect. And these were the core messages set by the pioneers. I think Bang Jong-han also stressed that the respect for the different capacities of the child, the evolving capacities, that by his letter to to adults and fundamental conditions for youth movement, and when he also wrote letters to children, he said that children have the potential to become good, excellent persons. It's just our responsibility to allow that and to provide a space and environment for children to develop to their maximum potential. And I think this draws back to the 20th century international human rights concept of inalienable and indivisible rights of human beings because you're a human being.
Thank you. Thank you. Could I ask you to reflect on what might be some of the differences also between these four people? One of the things that strikes me is that in each instance, our four heroes were dealing with situations where children were suffering greatly. Each one of them, and I think Janis Korczak, one of his most memorable acts was his decision to die with the children that he loved so much. But it strikes me that however honourable she was, Eglantine perhaps was a little different from the other three in her attitude to children. I'm influenced partly by the fact that she referred to children as it. And in her biography, comments are made sometimes that she liked the idea of the child, but she wasn't very fond of children under feet. Whereas Korczak, on the other hand, he literally put down his life for the children. Do you see a difference there in the attitude between these four in terms of, yes, wanting the material basics for the children, but that, particularly with Korczak, he really went one step further to say, we need to not just provide for these children, but we need to really honour them because of who they are, rather than because we continue. Am I being unfair to Eglantine?
Yeah.
You should defend her too.
I think that's an important aspect. I repeat once more, for Korczak it was so important that he discovered that it's important to speak with children. It means he put children somehow on the same level as an adult. The child has her own experience, his own aspirations, and you have to take notice of it and honor it. So I think that's why he didn't like all these notions which invite children to participate, but his idea was children join us adults in organizing our lives. And so even he calls it self-governance. And that's something else than starting with suffering children and with the need for protection. It's really empowering children, or to give them the place they deserve.
To give us a little variation, I'll go. Maybe the point that I want to make may have some connections with the other pioneers, but in our language, in the Korean language, there are different levels of language. When one speaks to the adult, a higher adult is one level, one who speaks to a very immediate adult, one peers, and lower to children, and if you're from a different class, from the nobility class to the peasant class, it was different. But Bang Jung-won, with his insistence on using the honorific language to children, I think was a symbol of what his respect to honor the children was. The difference I find in Bang Jung-won's work and the other work is, although they all visioned the protection and promotion and enjoyment of rights, but Bang Jung-won really spoke of labor issues, prohibition of labor under the age of 14, and he does mention corporal punishment too. He says not to punish them physically, harsh discipline. And the third thing was that he was so interested and he emphasized art and play. And I think that maybe it reflected his own interest, but he felt strongly that children through art can express themselves. And perhaps it was during the historical time period where perhaps the only expression of oppression or of revolting against the hierarchical society or the Japanese colonialism was probably through art and songs and play. So these are, I think, the differences that I find in Bang Jung-won.
Yes, when we talk about the human rights in a multicultural context, usually we distinguish, those who are engaged in the research on the social philosophies usually distinguish the human rights as legal norm from human rights as an underlying philosophy. Namely, idea is, for instance, we shouldn't kill children, and we must protect children from violence. That's kind of universally acceptable in a social norm, and it should be put into translations in each legal language, in the French, in the penal code, Japanese penal code, whatever. But then, why children must be protected? Why they are so valuable? For these kind of questions, we have different answers depending on the different cultural contexts. So, for instance, it's quite simple examples which I always give to my students. Namely, in the Christian societies, so it's because in the human is a creation by God, and therefore, most similar to the image of the God. That's why they are valuable. But in this East Asia, we have a different concept. For instance, in my country, generally, I think it's acceptable to think that human is a part of the human life is a part of the much wider nature, and which should be also respected. And this nature includes everything: animals, and also plants, and even non-organic things like stones, everything. But those things should be respected. Therefore, human life must be also respected. So I think this, at the level of this underlying justification, then we might have a different kind of concept.
Good. Yes.
maybe I go back to the beginning. I'm thinking about whether this development to codification of child right also somehow is related to the modernization of the world. For a long time, maybe all the time, children were seen as members of their family. One expected that more or less they become copies of their parents. At least in Europe it was very often the case that the child learned the occupation, the profession of the father, and if the family had a farm, children again ran this farm, or when it's a workshop, okay, the workshop. But then the world changed. More possibility for life courses. And it was not so sure that the child's place would be the family. The parents protected the child, so the child left the family. It needs protection on the one hand, but it also had to evolve capacities to find its place in this world. And we must guarantee provisions that the child can find its place. And it's both the interest of the individual as the interest of the society at large. And this does not yet mean we must have child rights, but somehow there was something in the air. And I think this also helped to think about rights of children and about ways how to guarantee these rights. And in different ways our heroes are related to this problem. But maybe it's important for all of them. And maybe more for your thinkers and practitioners, maybe they were more involved in societal transformation as was Crock, because of the political situation in Poland. He tried to create the new world in his orphanages. And in his ideas, he was talking about cooperating and living together in such a home. It's important for future life, but he focused on this domain of life, while the others were more involved with societal developments. At least I'm asking you, is this an idea which explains some differences?
That is my last question to each of you. It strikes me that each of our heroes were very radical in their time. Now, in some ways, I think Eglantine was the one who really understood politics and worked politics to try and get a legal result, literally. But the others, it strikes me, were very much outliers. So the last question is, so how did their big idea survive? How were they treated at the time? Of course, we know Crock was killed. But how were our heroes in Japan and Korea? How did they fare, and how did that spark?
I have to admit that I'm going to speak very boldly, looking back into our social context. I think when Bang Jong-hwan lived and when his colleagues lived at that time, our society must have been torn between Confucianism and Buddhism and Taoism and Chandogyo. And it was all in relation to Buddhism. One of the main teachings or thoughts of Buddhism is life after the next life. So if if you're born in a miserable situation, if you do good, your situation will be better in your life afterwards. And I think that's had some bearing on the importance of children as future leaders, which I think it directly contradicts with what children's rights activists would say. And Confucianism that put such it was used as governing rule, as most of us would know, to put order into the society. But also, I'm going to be very bold in saying that, and admitting that Pang Jung-hwan passed away at a very young age, and before his work really took off the ground, and it kind of sizzled down in our society. And we went to liberation, we went to the Korean War, and then we went into a very rapid period of modernization and democratization. And then all of a sudden, and I have to owe this to the Human Rights, Children's Rights Convention, where people started to rethink, hey, wait a minute, we had this important pioneer many, many years ago in our society. Let's look at his work again. And in terms of children's rights, his work was mostly revered as children's literature and his other movement, but not in terms of children's rights. And we're doing this now, and we're trying to keep his message alive. But there is the Pang Jung-hwan Foundation here, who's trying to do that, and other scholars and activists are trying to do that. But unfortunately, he lived a very short life, and his influence did not live into the modern democratic society.
What was revolutionary with Crock, and also the question why still today a lot of people have difficulty to accept his ideas and implement them. Maybe it's also a problem of the generations. Maybe even more here, but also in Europe, a long time one was expecting progress from the well-educated, most experienced old people, at least older people, or at least from the adults. And then we observe that the older people tend to live in their routines of life. Are they able to make up for the rapid change in societies? And now we have young people. We often learn that they are quicker to pick up what happens in the world of technology and electronics and so on. But maybe even this is no good example. Children understand the world of adults very well. I mean, children know both parents go to work and that they have to spend some time of the day elsewhere, that there is a limited time problem and so on. And so the idea came up, we need the experience of the older people, but also we need the fresh view of the younger ones. They have curiosity, they explore the world, and we must foster and promote this fresh new attitude to the world. Again, it's not the same as to adopt a convention on the rights of the child, but I think all this belongs together.
Professor Lee has reminded me that I haven't asked you if you have any questions. So could I invite you to raise your hand if you have a question?
I did find a common theme that you all mentioned how the ideas of these heroes influence the way we think of human rights today. And you also mentioned that our ideas of human rights and child rights are constantly evolving. Do you think that we've reached these ideas that was mentioned by our heroes, or do you still think there are aspects that we need to achieve to fulfill their ideas about child rights?
Thank you very much for your questions. And responding to your questions, just let me start with how this Toyohiko Kagawa was treated before in the pre-war Japan. When he was a high school student, he refused to attend the class of military exercise. And military officers actually beaten and hit him, but he never followed their orders. That's one thing. And also he was arrested a couple of times because of his anti-war, because he's an absolute pacifist as social reformers and Christians. So he was a couple of times arrested. And but quite sadly, actually he met Mahatma Gandhi before the Second World War. And Gandhi, Toyohiko Kagawa asked Mahatma Gandhi how you would respond to this Japanese militaristic government when you were in Japan. And Gandhi clearly mentioned that I keep saying what I have said, and if I'll be killed, I'll be killed. Then Toyohiko Kagawa replied that if I'm alone, I will follow what you mentioned. But since he has in the brothers and sisters and all the project, so finally, not quite explicitly, but he made some compromise with Japanese militarist government then. Now, we are here in 2013. We had still certain kind of human rights violations. For instance, in Japan, we had a quite huge earthquake which created a breakout of a nuclear power plant in Fukushima. And not all the information is not disclosed, and people are suffering there. So I think even today we have something to do to realize the human rights.
The world is constantly changing and new issues are emerging. When our pioneers were living and when the international norms and standards were being finalized, some issues never emerged then. For instance, I note two very important issues that never emerged was climate change. Our pioneers never dealt with climate change. And the next issue is the trafficking and sexual exploitation of girls and commodifying girls, pornography and cyber texting and cyber ICT development. It was something that was never conceived of during the times of our pioneers and during the timing of the international norms. Have we achieved what our pioneers wanted? I don't think so, because in our society, he explicitly said to respect children and to not scold them harshly or discipline them harshly. But we tend to hit our children, we tend to demean our children, and so these things are always being violated. And I think the full realization is when we need to implement and monitor, and this is where the civil society and youth and young people must do to monitor and advocate for themselves, and it's our responsibility to provide the environment for that.
Some of the similarities between the rights of children and the rights of persons with disabilities, but also some of the important differences. I agree with Lotta that human rights have developed during the 20th century in part because of modernisation and the coming together of the world, and in part because of social upheaval. But the differences between we persons with disabilities and children are ones of degree. We were all children when we were born, and most of us become parents of children. Children are part and parcel of our lives. But not until the 20th century were persons with disabilities seen as persons. We were seen as the other. Often, if we were born with disability, under Confucianism, even under elements of Christianity, we were seen as perhaps the result of sins of our parents. However, the coming together of the world and social upheaval altered that. Just as the social upheaval of the First World War brought into sharp focus for Anquetin the needs of children, the huge numbers of wounded and disabled soldiers after World War I and during World War I meant that people thought of disabled people differently. That person who was injured by the shell fragments could have been me. We stopped being the other and we became part of humanity. And we also saw developing the medical model of disabilities. What we must do after social calamities of World War I, World War II, and yes, the Korean War, is to cure as much as we can people with disabilities. So we ended up on the central stage not until 1950. And we continued on, more and more persons with disabilities obtained education, and we piggybacked on movements for human rights. We learned a lot from the women's movement in the 1960s and from the children's movement in the 1970s. Interestingly, the leaders of what we might call the social model of disabilities in the 70s and early 80s were not people who were born with a disability like myself. Rather, they were people who suffered accidents and had experienced lives as ordinary people and then had to relearn their lives as persons with disability. And they saw, and we disabled people saw, the need to equate our difficulties with central human rights, that it would be human rights that would allow us to have inherent dignity and allow us to demand that barriers not be put in our place by society and by all stereotypes. And finally, I want to agree with Professor Yang Yi Lee. I think the world is constantly changing, and the last 2 decades where persons with disabilities have had their own convention, and where technology has allowed many of us to be educated, not just in the developed world, but in the developing world. And I might add here that the Korean technology for the blind is perhaps some of the best in the world, getting close to the United States. But the world's changing. We're going to see more and more emphasis on persons with disabilities and human rights. We're going to see more and more emphasis upon transgender people. We are recognising that the human family is diverse, and what we all need to do is make sure that all of us, whether we're children, disabled, women, transgender, whether we're trafficked, whatever, that we're all part of the human family and we are all entitled to the same human rights in order that we may have more harmonious societies. Thanks very much.